Okay, we can begin.
All right. So are we live?
We're live.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the migration panel for H2D2 Research Day. We have three very exciting presentations lined up. Yannay Spitzer, Sandra Spirovska, and Eduardo Cenci will be sharing their very exciting work with us. Just as a reminder, every speaker will have 15 minutes, and then there's going to be a 5-minute question period after every speaker. I'll give speakers a reminder at 13 minutes that their time is almost up. And I would encourage everyone who's participating to please line up your comments on the event chat. That's worked pretty well in prior sessions, and if you get your comments in there, you'll be the first to be able to ask your question during the 5-minute question period. In fact, actually, I think what I'll do is I'll just have the speakers read your questions and then answer them during the 5-minute question periods. We actually won't have live verbal back and forth during that period. In any case, let's get started. We'll have Yannay Spitzer first. From Hebrew University, presenting like an ink blot on paper. Yannay, take it away.
All right. So can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, very good. I'll just put my presentation on. My presentation is on full screen right now.
Looks good.
Okay, looks good. So I'm going to do something that I've never done before, which is to go on script. So it's going to be a little bit awkward, and I may stumble a little bit. So I hope you'll excuse me. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining in, and thanks for the organizers for not giving up and making this day happen. Today I'm presenting joint work with Ariel Zimran, which goes back to what we think of as one of the biggest questions of the age of mass migration. So here is the question. The figure shows the share of European immigration to the United States coming from each major source country over the age of mass migration. We can see that before about 1890, almost all European immigration to the US came from the so-called old source countries, primarily Germany, Britain, and Ireland. Around 1890, we see a rapid shift, such that by 1900, the bulk of European immigration to the US came from the so-called new source countries of the European periphery, primarily Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This has puzzled economic historians. If people from high living standard countries like Germany and Britain found it advantageous to migrate as early as the 1850s, surely people from the new source countries would have found it advantageous as well. But they did not take advantage of the opportunity to move to the US for decades, before suddenly surging to dominance of US immigration. Why did they wait so long to move, and why did they surge so rapidly when they started? This is what we refer to as the delayed migration puzzle, and this paper is an attempt to revise the explanation for it. The standard explanation among economic historians is that this delay was, broadly speaking, due to delayed development. Mass migration was caused by processes of economic and demographic modernization, such as industrialization, urbanization, and the demographic transition, which removed poverty constraints, reduced connections to the land, and increased demographic pressures. This happened later in the new source countries, which is why migration from these countries was delayed. We refer to this type of explanation as the internalist view, in the sense that the timing of the onset of mass migration was determined primarily by incentives in the place of origin. Another explanation comes from social historians. It argues that mass migration required linkage to networks of chain migration. These networks spread over time from places experiencing mass migration, transmitted by short-distance social links. The timing of mass migration depended on the time it took for these networks to reach places where conditions for mass migration were ripe. In other words, a place could have had a very high underlying demand for migration for a very long time, even decades, but this pent-up demand would be unleashed only when the networks diffuse and reach its environment. Italy, for example, had been ripe for migration decades earlier, except that the diffusion process became sufficiently advanced only during the 1890s. We refer to this explanation as the diffusion hypothesis. The diffusion hypothesis was dismissed by economic historians, frankly, with very little evidence at hand. And in the past 2 decades, the question remained dormant. We believe, on the other hand, that we have a very good evidence against the internalist view and in favor of the diffusion hypothesis. So the specific thing that we do in this paper is to test the diffusion hypothesis in the context of Italy between 1876 and 1920, with a new commune level and district level dataset. This is the first time that the diffusion hypothesis is being rigorously tested based on sufficiently rich datasets, an explicit theoretical framework with testable predictions, and a verification of the mechanism of spatial contagion. The sum of our findings is that all evidence points strongly in favor of the diffusion hypothesis as the most plausible explanation for the delayed migration from Italy. This leads us to argue that the current consensus among economic historians regarding the causes for the rise of the new migration ought to be revised. The theoretical framework, in our theoretical framework, the underlying demand of individuals to migrate is determined in a standard way by factors such as wage differentials between the origin and the destination. But in order to migrate, an individual must be linked to the destination. In this sense, migration is a technology to which individuals gain access when someone to whom they are linked has migrated. Alternatively, an individual could become spontaneously linked with a connection to without a connection to a prior migrant, in which case we refer to him, when he migrates, as a pioneer. So we borrow both structures and terms from the epidemiological literature. How timely. For example, in this diagram, there are 3 communes, A on the left, B in the center, and C on the right. Individual A1 in commune A on the left was the first to leave. He was a pioneer in the sense that he had no prior links to another previous migrant. Individual A1 was linked to 2 other persons in commune A, A2 and A3. When he migrated, they became linked themselves, gained the option to migrate, and linked 4 more individuals in commune A, who then gained the option to migrate. So far, this was a chain of intra-communal diffusion. Individual A3 was linked also to individual B1 in nearby commune B. This is a case of inter-communal diffusion. On the far right, commune C, individual C1 became spontaneously linked. If he migrates, he will become a pioneer, which may start a spontaneous independent chain of migration. The theoretical premises of the diffusion hypothesis are 2. First, pioneers are sufficiently rare. And second, intercommunal diffusion occurs across neighboring communes and rarely leaps across large distances. The 2 may be sufficient to generate an observable pattern of spatial diffusion that can explain the delayed migration puzzle. The first thing that we do is to test 4 major testable predictions and patterns of the diffusion hypothesis. I will go briefly over each of them, giving just a flavor of the theory and the evidence. The first prediction is of convergence in migration rates across the country. This graph plots the annual coefficient of variation of district-level immigration rates over time. We can see clear evidence of sigma convergence. As migration networks diffuse over the country, a source of variation in migration rates is removed, and the country converges to a lower spread. We also see clear evidence of beta convergence. This graph plots the average annual immigration of a district for the period 1876-1899 on the horizontal axis, and the change in immigration rates after 1900 on the vertical axis. There is a very strong negative trend. Districts with high migration rates before 1900 experienced only a small increase, whereas those with low initial immigration rates experienced a large increase. Notice that the scales are logarithmic. Many districts that started low were raising their rates tenfold and more, whereas the leading districts stagnated at a higher rate. In fact, 1 on the vertical axis, which implies no change in rates of migration, appears to be the absolute lower bound. This is consistent with a scenario in which the laggards are catching up with the leaders. Places not yet in mass migration are experiencing a big surge as they get linked to migration networks. Places that already produce mass migration are saturated and have no scope for an increase, but are also not diminishing the rates either. The next predicted pattern is that we should see S-shaped time series in migration rates of particular places. Migration rates should be low before anyone in an area is linked to migrant networks. When the networks arrive, we should see a rapid surge in migration rates as the migration technology diffuses. Finally, once everyone in an area is linked, there is no more scope to increase the rates and migration stabilizes. In this graph, we plot the time series of immigration from several bins of districts that are separated by distance from the district to which we refer as epicenters, those in which we first observe mass migration to the United States. The S-shaped curves in this figure, though not as pretty as we'd want them to be, clearly show that districts far from the epicenter do experience a surge followed by stagnation, whereas districts near the epicenters are seen in the later stages of the S-curves. So the most important prediction is that we should see migration initially confined to just a few small areas, the epicenters, and that it should spread from them in an orderly spatial expansion. I will now show you a series of maps that plot the average annual migration rates for a series of half-decades on a constant scale, going all the way to World War I. I will let the maps speak for themselves. Okay, so we're starting in 1876, 1880, and I'm going to go half-decade by half-decade. And here is the end of the process, where we think of Italy as being saturated. I'll do it quickly again at the commune level. You're going to see more or less the same picture, but it's going to be much more vivid. So there are about 8,000 communes in Italy that we cover, but unfortunately we can only go back to 1884 at the commune level. Okay, and here we are again at saturation. So places such as Eastern Sicily, that initially had no migration at all in 1880. Okay, so Eastern Sicily is here. Okay, and I'm going to show you what happens at the beginning. Okay, so no migration at all in Eastern Sicily. Okay, and at the end periods, it's full-on mass migration. Surge within 20 years to some of the highest rates of voluntary overseas migration ever seen in world history. The internalist view leads us to believe that something fundamental must have changed there, but it is hard to imagine any continuous process that should produce such an incredible leap. The point made by the diffusion hypothesis is that the primary thing that made the difference between no migration to mass migration was the arrival of migration networks from other regions just around that time. Eastern Sicily, as well as other late-coming places, had always had this potential, but it was waiting for the networks to arrive. Another way to see this is by plotting the immigration rate against distance from what we call the mass migration frontier. This is the contour of districts that had already reached a threshold of mass migration by the previous half-decade. As a rule, in every period, conditional on not having experienced mass migration yet, high rates of immigration are observed only within a radius of about 50 kilometers from the frontier of the previous half-decade. The last prediction is that nearby areas should be correlated in their destination choices because they should be part of the same networks, and networks must be destination-specific. This table shows the result of regressing dissimilarity index for the destinations, we're talking about different countries in the world, of each province pair in Italy on the distance between them. Regardless of how we cut the sample and whether or not we control for differences in observable characteristics between provinces, we see a clear positive relationship between distance and dissimilarity. Okay. The next part of our analysis looks in more detail at the spatial contagion mechanism that is behind the frontier effect. One may suspect that we can get similar patterns not as a result of a diffusion of migration networks. This might happen, for instance, if industrialization spread out spatially, and industrialization itself was the real cause for the onset of mass migration, and you could replace industrialization with anything that you have in mind. To be clear, we are not aware that there is evidence of anything like this happening in Italy. Certainly nothing that can cause such a sharp outcome, but we must assume that this is nevertheless a possibility. The other concern is that we might just be picking up spatially correlated shocks.
Yannay, this
Yes.
is Dean. I just wanted to warn you, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
To address this, we look for a process of spatial contagion in which migration from one commune causes emigration from its neighbors. The first step is to formalize the spatial expansion result that we saw before. We regress the log of a commune's emigration rate on commune and year fixed effects, the lag of its own migration, and some controls. The most important is this E not IT, which we call the lagged emigration exposure. It's a distance on population-weighted measure of the emigration rates of nearby communes. It can be thought of as the probability that an out-of-commune acquaintance has migrated in the previous period, when the probability of a personal link is decaying with distance. The coefficient of interest is beta, which could be interpreted as an elasticity. Okay. These are the OLS results. I'm not going to go over them, but we get an elasticity on the order of 0.25 because I need to move on. The more interesting thing is that we have an obvious endogeneity problem. Okay, so we develop a new IV approach to address these issues. I will avoid the technicalities and describe the intuition instead using this figure. Take two communes, A and B, that are identical in every way, including their distance from epicenter E. Mass migration is expanding from the epicenter and eventually reaches the neighboring communes A and B. There is one important difference between these two communes. While both of them stand at the same distance from the epicenter, the neighbors of A are on average closer to the epicenters than B's neighbors. This means that commune A will be exposed earlier to migration networks simply because of the spatial arrangement of communes around it. The main identifying assumption is that the spatial distribution of neighbors' population around the commune are uncorrelated with anything that has an impact on immigration, except for the spread of networks. So to cut it short, I'll skip the procedure. I'll just tell you that it's not only the results not only survive this AV instrument, but it's also they also become stronger. Okay, so let me conclude. Okay, so what do we learn from this paper? Of course, it helped us to understand the delayed migration puzzle. There's still more to do here. This paper shows that there was a diffusion process operating in Italy during the age of mass migration. It remains to be shown that this was the primary factor determining the timing of mass migration and not a second-order cause. Eventually, what is at stake here is a very important question in American economic history. Why did millions of would-be Americans migrate when they did, and not decades earlier? And why did millions of would-be Americans never migrate at all? So thank you very much. Thank you, Dean, for following this. This is still work in progress, and we would love to hear your comments. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Yannay. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
We have 4 minutes for questions. Stephanie, as my other moderator, can you confirm? It doesn't look like there are any actual written questions that have been posed. And if not, I have a question I can raise.
Yeah, there's nothing right now. So the way that you post a question is by asking it.
Okay, Yannay,
Yes,
these are fascinating patterns you're finding here. I'm wondering if any, do you think there are any market factors that may be facilitating this diffusion via social networks, or do you view it as a purely person-to-person process? I guess I'm thinking in particular about the role of migration middlemen or sellers of travel services like ship passage. Could these types of market players be exploiting networks to drive sales? I mean, what do you know, or what do you think may be going on in terms of commercial interest or players that may be exploiting these networks?
So there is a very important story about what we call recruited migrants leaving Italy. This is primarily true for South America and mainly to Brazil, which had actually a state-funded project to invite Italian immigrants to work in plantations in Brazil after the abolition of slavery. Another story is the story of the padrone, which are kind of like Italian bosses sitting in Italy and basically recruiting gangs of workers whom they don't have necessarily personal relations to, to come to work in sweatshops and in other places in New York and in the East Coast. Now, as it turns out, the evidence that we have on these cases is that even those kind of like recruited and agents, they still were indirectly based on, frequently based on personal relations. So we see people who are recruited by bosses, but they're also joining in friends and relatives. So ultimately, it's an empirical question. We know that there are other factors that can cause migration to spread in kind of like a more hectic way and not spread along the map. Really, the question is like, do those factors override the personal relations? And I think our findings suggest that leaps across provinces and just kind of like random, spontaneous new epicenters are very rare and don't drive the macro pattern.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I don't view this as a competing explanation, but I view it as something that may sort of operate through, may magnify the patterns that you're finding.
They're actually complementary. I mean, those Italian padrone are kind of complementary to the networks, and they ride over them.
Yeah. There's one more question. I don't know if you can see that, Yannay, from Eduardo.
Yeah. So do you look at Italy to Europe migration flows only? And if so, how would adding out migration to countries like Argentina and Brazil change your results? So that's also a very good.
A quick 30 seconds to answer that, please, before we move on.
Thanks. Italians left to all destinations. The United States is just the cleanest story. We do follow Brazil and Argentina, and we do follow Europe, which are very important. It's a bit more messy there because in Europe, distance to the border matter. And so it's very natural. And that's actually what we see, that migration kind of like spread away from the border. But I don't think it's a proof of what we want to show. In South America, it's a bit more complicated because migration started earlier, but then it was hit by a series of crises in South America. So we kind of like see the diffusion process at its later stages. In the United States, we see the diffusion starting from its very inception all the way to saturation. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, Yannay, thank you very much. Let's give Yannay a round of applause virtually. Let's move on to our next speaker. So we have Sandra Spirovska from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she'll be speaking on the effect of migration on college enrollment and college major choice. So please welcome Sandra.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can everyone see what I'm actually? You cannot. 1 second. Share screen. All right.
That looks great.
All right. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So I will be presenting my projects on what are the effects of migration opportunities on college attainment and college major choice. So to give you a little bit of a background, so it is well known that having a college degree comes with a wage premium, and that also there are large differences in earning across different college majors. And also the studies have shown that expected earnings are important when choosing a major. Now, for people who are in developed countries, think, you're in the US, it might be the case that knowing the expected earnings or the earnings potential of your major within your country is enough to make a choice, of course, conditional on other things. But this might not be the case for people in developing countries. So, in fact, seeking better job opportunities and higher pay pushes a lot of people who are in developing countries to migrate. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that when a person in a developing country makes these college choices, do I go to college, would I major in, they take into account not only the local labor market conditions or the labor conditions in their country, but also the labor market conditions of destination countries, right? So you can think of someone who is in a developing country looking at something like a destination country where a lot of people have gone in previous years from, the person's country, and they can think of, okay, what is what should I major in so that I make myself more attractive for these foreign labor markets so that I can more easily migrate and earn higher wages. So if that's the case, then changes to migration policies may change the educational investment decisions of these individuals because in a way they redefine labor markets. Now, this is important from a development perspective because it can potentially lead to skill mismatch, and also it could lead to brain drain, and many sending countries fear these negative impacts on long-run growth. Sorry, I forgot to just do this. So the research question that I ask, there are two research questions. One is, do higher migration prospects increase college enrollment and completion? And the other one is, do they affect the choice of college major? I will breeze through the literature. My paper, what I'm presenting today and what I'm not presenting today is connected to several different strands of literature. One is literature on migration and human capital accumulation. There's a long list of papers that look at how changes in migration rates affect the human capital stock in sending locations. And, sometimes they find brain gain, sometimes they find brain drain. But in all of these cases, the outcome they look at is human capital level. So the decision of, do I go to college or not, right? I look at both levels and fields of study. That would be my contribution relative to this literature. Also, there are some papers that look at migration behavior by college major. So they take college major as exogenous. Instead, what I am thinking of with this project is that when you make your college decision and college major choice, you are thinking about your migration behaviors, and you account for them when you make these education choices. There's also a large literature on college major choice. There's several papers that model explicitly college enrollment, college major choice as a function of observable and unobservable ability, affinity, and also earnings, but there's no link between migration intentions or location preference and major choice in these models. So, and I'm not presenting this today, but I do have a structural model of college enrollment and major choice with a migration option. And I have recently seen that in the international trade literature, people are starting to be thinking about how within a trade model, how does migration policy affect occupational choice and maybe education decisions? But so far what I've seen is that college attendance is again taken as exogenous, and I will relax this assumption. So, okay, so for today, I'm presenting just design-based reduced form results, and I will use the 2004 European Union accession process as a source of exogenous variation and migration opportunities, therefore future expected earnings. I will use a difference in event study approaches, and I find an increase in both college enrollment and graduation. And I also find some evidence of sorting into certain majors like IT, social sciences, business, health, and services, which are all majors that in my setting were associated with occupations with labor shortages in old EU member states. Now, I talk about European Union. I have to tell you what's going on here for those of you who might not know. So what is the EU? It's an economic and political union that ties 27 now countries into a single market. It basically, the benefits of being in the EU is that there's free movement of people, goods, services, and capital. So there are no borders. It's a single market. And what is the accession process? What is the accession process like? Well, there are 3 stages. In the first stage, a country becomes a candidate for accession. It might take years. It might take more than a decade to be, to get from a candidate to the second stage, which is to start negotiations for accession. Once negotiations start, it is pretty certain that a country will enter the EU. And then after this negotiation process, the countries sign an accession treaty with the EU that basically says you're going to enter the EU on this date. I'm going to be looking at the 2004 accession or enlargement. And basically in May 2004, 8 former socialist countries, think lower income, plus Malta and Cyprus, joined the EU. Negotiations for them started in March 1998. They ended in 2002, and the accession treaty was signed in April 2003. Why am I telling you this? Well, even though the countries entered the EU in 2004, it might be that people in these countries started anticipating this change in migration costs or migration opportunities well before that 2004 date. And namely, maybe they started anticipating it in March 1998. Now, as I walk you through my analysis and results, I want you to keep in mind that most trade and capital flow barriers were lifted before negotiations even started. So the only thing that was uncertain was still the free movement of workers. And I have a quote here from the European Commission that confirms that. I will skip it for time. So I will basically use the 1998 negotiations as a treatment that decreases anticipated migration costs and increases expected future earning of these NMS new member states. All right, very briefly, I used the European Union Labor Force Survey micro-level data. It is very much like the CPS. It is a great data set because it has harmonized data for 30 countries since the 80s and in the 90s and until 2000 today, 18, 19. The variables that I will be using are the education variables. So what is the highest degree attained, year when the degree was successfully completed, field of study, and education status in prior 4 weeks or prior year. Demographic variables, there are not that many. There's age and 5-year bins. I obviously know the current country of residence, but I also have nationality and country of birth in broad country groups, gender and marital status. So I will use a combination of these nationality, country of birth variables to account for selective migration in my analysis. So I do a very simple difference in difference specification. So I regress variable Y, which is a binary outcome variable on college attainment field of study for individual I residing in country C at time T. Treat equals 1 if country C entered the EU in 2004. Post equals 1 if the E or T is after 1998. And X are some individual characteristics. For now, they're going to be gender and marital status. I will estimate as via linear probability model, and the coefficient of interest is the beta 3, which will tell me what is the effect anticipating changes in migration prospects on educational outcomes for those who are in the treated group. Okay, I have to satisfy the parallel trends assumption. Does it hold? I will run an event study very much analogous to the diff and diff, where I plug in leads and lags. And what we want is that this phi tau to be statistically indistinguishable from 0 for years before 1998, which is the year I normalized to 0. That will be the event here. All right. Here's the first diff and diff. So what I do here, the outcome variable is whether a person aged 25 to 29 has a college degree, and it's 0, so it's 1 if they do have a college degree and 0 otherwise if they don't. The pre-treatment years are 1993 to 1998, and the post-treatment years are 1999 to 2009. For most of these results, I will use only Poland and Italy. Poland is the treated country and Italy is the control, because Poland is the largest country that entered the EU in 2004. It had a lot of migration out of Poland after EU accession, and also it is easier to keep track of all of the things that changed in 1 or 2 countries rather than 28 for now. So what I find is what this coefficient basically says is that anticipating changes in migration opportunities induce people to graduate from college. The likelihood increased by 8.7 percentage points in graduating from college by late 20s. Okay? So this is higher for women. So women have an 11.5 percentage point higher probability in holding a college degree by their late 20s relative to the pre-period, relative to Italy, and men have a 6 percentage point higher likelihood. All right, this is the event study. It looks like, you want it to look this way. There's no pre-trends, and then there is an increase in the likelihood of having a college degree after the 1998 event. The next outcome that I look at is college enrollment. So it's not just important whether people graduated, although that is probably the more important thing, but it's also important what their intentions were. So I create this binary variable that equals to 1 if a person who was around 20 years old had enrolled in college, and 0 if they had not. And the pre and post years are the same, and the treatment control are the same. What I find is that in anticipation of migration, changes to migration opportunities in the future, people were 4.5 percentage points more likely to enroll in college once they started anticipating EU accession and easier migration in the future.
Hi, Sandra, this is Dean.
Yes.
Just wanted to remind you, you have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes. Okay, I will speed through this. All right, this is the event study. Now, the meat of the paper, or what I think is the more important part, is to look at the specific majors, right? Graduating in a specific major or enrolling in a specific major. I will only show you the event study graphs for those majors that were based on labor shortages in destination countries should have been affected. So what I find is that for social sciences, ICT, and services, I find these, no pre-trends, and then increases for some of them, pretty stark increases in likelihoods of graduating in that major. And the outcome variable here is a binary, again, equal to 1 if you were graduating with given major, and 0 if you were graduating with any other major, right? Health doesn't look that great, so I will not make any claims, but it does seem like right around EU accession, this really shoots up. But because of the pre-trends, I'm not willing to take a stand on that. This is the definitive. Okay, this is enrollment in college majors. So if you're willing to ignore whatever weird thing is happening in 1997, some of these look pretty nice, especially for health and services. And ICT, there's nothing going on, but in health and services at least, and also to some extent in social sciences, there is also a sharp increase in likelihood of enrolling after negotiations start, and especially after the negotiations ended, which was in 2002. All right, I will skip that. It's the same. I will not recap. I will do that at the end. Now, selective migration. Does it play a role? As I mentioned, I try to put people back in their countries of birth, but I cannot always do that because I only observe a broad country group for country of birth. So I can observe if they were born in a new member state. So what I do is that I just take everyone who says they were born in a new member state and stick them in the treatment group. But then because there might be differences in the skill distribution between people in Poland and all the migrants, I just use all of the new member states or the 8 member states. And then for the treatment group and for the control, I use all EU member countries that were there before, EU 15 states. Think UK, France, Italy, Portugal, and so forth. This is what I find. So this is for graduation and enrollment. I find that the pattern of increased likelihood and graduating and enrolling stands. Majors, it's a little iffy. I see it's noisier. I do see the pattern for social sciences and to some extent IT, but there are pre-trends in health and there's nothing in services. So this is somewhere where I still need to do a lot of work to understand what are the things that happen in all of these other countries that may be confounding maybe affecting the decision of what to do, what to study. All right. So I will conclude. I find that better migration prospects increase college enrollment and graduation. Find some evidence of sorting into college majors that are in high demand abroad. And I do find that women exhibit larger effects on college enrollment and graduation. So I probably am out of time.
All right, thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, thank you.
We have 2 minutes left to take to answer these questions that have popped up here. Can you see them?
Okay, I see one from you. Would it also make sense here or in the Q&A?
The Q&A there, yeah. Feel free to go to the Q&A. I don't want to hog all the questions. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting results. Have you been able to look at what Polish immigrants do once they arrive to their destination country? No, I have not looked at that yet. I am concentrating on just sending countries and what is happening with people in sending countries. Romanian immigrants in Spain and Italy, I found some evidence of a diminished college wage premium despite positive effects. This is really interesting. I have not looked at Romanian and Bulgarian immigrants, actually. Romania and Bulgaria entered the EU in 2007. I am reluctant to look at them in my context because they may have anticipated changes well before entering the EU or any trade restrictions lifted. So I have not incorporated that, but very good suggestion. I thank you. Okay, is it possible that these results are driven by the labor market structure change induced by joining the EU, not directly driven the migration incentive? Yes, so actually, okay, so this gets at something that I said about FDI and trade, so exports. It could be that people were, it could be that FDI was flowing in the country and maybe, the UK IT firm was opening offices in Poland and hiring people that way in Poland. So maybe Polish people were responding to the hope that they can work in Poland in IT, not to migrate. That is true. The reason why I was stressing that all of these capital and trade barriers were lifted well before negotiation is because all of this should have happened even before negotiations started. So it should be affecting people before and after. But I am in the process of collecting data on FDI and trade, so maybe I will be better able to answer the question in the future. Do I have more time or no?
I think I'm very happy that people are so interested in asking you questions, but unfortunately we're already late for Eduardo, so I don't want to cut into his time. Why don't we wrap up and encourage folks with questions to follow up with Sandra separately. Thank you, Sandra. Let's give her a round of applause. Yay. And now let's move on. Yes, thank you. Let's move on and have Eduardo Cenci from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's presenting on internal migration and the spread of long-term impacts of historical immigration in Brazil. Eduardo, take it away.
Hi, thank you, Dean. Thank you all for coming here. Let me start sharing my slides with you all. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Let me go. So this joint work with Daniel Lopes and Leonardo Monasterio, two colleagues from Brazil who created the data set and the algorithm that we use here for our surname-based classification ancestries, which I'll explain in a minute. And this is also, as a sign, it's going to be my job mark paper, so your feedback's much appreciated, more than ever. So here we're looking at how internal migration can spread long-term impacts of historical immigration, and we look at this in the context of Brazil. So the motivation is that historic events, many of them, like immigration shocks in the age of mass migrations, they have long-term impacts. There's a large literature documenting this. Yannay is just one, Yannay's work with Ariel is just one other example of this type of studies. And in the context of Brazil, like again, Yannay, giving the segue, there's been a couple of studies more recently documenting long-lasting impacts of European settlements in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul, near Argentina, and also in the state of São Paulo. And pretty much these studies, they show that municipalities or locations who received an influx of immigrants from Europe, mostly German, Italians, some Polish, Russians, sometimes also from Japan. They exhibit today better economic outcomes. A common claim in this study is that human capital is the channel for this persistence of impact. The point we're trying to make in this paper here is that human capital, it moves. It moves across time, being transmitted within and between families, across generations, and also moves across space as people move around in the country that received them. So our research question here is precise that if internal migration spread the long-term positive impacts of the historical settlements, when I say historical, something between 1850 and 1940, if internal migration spread those impacts to other places in the country. So to give you a little bit of context, trying to show the map here. Okay, so if you're seeing this map, you have population density, these darker areas, starting higher population density at the coast of Brazil, as we'd expect, and then moving to the inner country to the west and the north as the population starts to spread, going to the west in a process that's kind of similar to what happened in the United States. If you see these white dots in the lower part of the map, those are those settlements that have been documented and studied in these other papers. So pretty much these other papers, they look at municipalities that have a white dot compared to municipalities that do not have a white dot, so who did not receive a settlement, that did not receive this influx, this immigration shock, and they see that municipalities that receive this immigration shock, they have better economic outcomes. But as we can see, population in Brazil moved from the south and southeast to the west and the north. And if people moved, the descendants of the historic immigrants moved as well. If the human capital of these original immigrants and their descendants plays a role in the long-lasting impacts, I would expect that some of this human capital was spread to these other areas and has been impacted economic development there as well. So let me return to my slides. So in order to answer our research question, you need a few things. It's empirically challenging. Ideally, you want two separate regions of the country, one that received this initial immigration shock and one that did not receive. I'm calling those injection points. Then you would like to have strong intranational migration, so people are moving from that region, the descendants of those historical immigrants, they're moving to the other parts of the country. Again, there's two things you can find in the United States, for example. Ideally, you would like to not have new immigration in that country because you don't want it to confound the effect of someone who is a descendant of a historical migrant with a new immigrant from the same countries. So that's, for example, what some people are trying to do here in the US, but kind of happened in Brazil. After 1940, international immigration decreased to almost zero. And fourth, you need, of course, a way to identify those descendants. You need to track those descendants of historic immigrants as they move in the country. So Brazil checks the first three requirements, and in this paper we propose a way to check the last one. We are using non-Iberian surnames. Let me explain this. By non-Iberian, I mean not Portuguese, not Spanish. The majority of Brazilians, they bear an Iberian surname, either Portuguese or Spanish surname, and that's due to colonial ties of Brazil and the neighboring countries of Spain and Portugal, and also the forceful integration of Blacks, former slaves, and the native population. The country experienced significant immigration from Italy, Germany, Japan, and some other countries between 1850 and 1940, and that was concentrated in the south and the southeast of the country. After World War II, international migration to Brazil plummeted, and we have internal migration going up significantly. And that was motivated by several processes, one of them, the expansion of agricultural frontier of the country, who moved a big amount of the population from the south and southeast to the Midwest and northeast of Brazil. So in this study, I'm focusing on the Brazil's agricultural frontier, which is a place that did not receive the original settlements, but did receive a lot of descendants later on. It's also a place whose migration flows I understand well, and I can come up with some instruments, for them. And finally, I will be looking at the period of 2004 to 2016, because the one for which I have data available. So that comprised 8 states, 13 years, around 1,500 municipalities. And the region of study, actually, I'll show that later. Okay, so the data source we're using here is called HICE, is an annual census of formal workers in Brazil. It's a matched employer-employee data. Informs all the demographic variables that you like to have. Wage would be our main outcome of interest. And importantly for us, the worker's name, because I need to look at their names to assign an ancestry to them and to identify them as being descendants or not. I have other data sets for complementary variables, controls, etc. And here I'm going to use as our main explanatory variable the concentration of descendants of historical migrants in a given municipality, which will be proxied by the concentration, the percentage of workers in the formal workforce of those municipalities who have a non-Iberian surname. I'll argue that having a non-Iberian surname, family name that's not Portuguese or not Spanish in Brazil today is a strong indicator that you are descending from someone who arrived in the country during the age of mass migrations, who arrived in the south and southeast around those injection points. So our empirical strategy will be, just to give an intuition, what you normally think of was to regress, for example, average weights in a municipality, state, and year on the concentration of descendants in that municipality, right? Then you would include some controls, and you would include some fixed effects, state fixed effects and year fixed effects. I do not use here municipality fixed effects. I would like to, because the concentration of descendants, my explanatory variable, does not vary a lot over time. So I go to the second best with state fixed effects. But what I actually use, because I can do better with all the data that I have, I run regressions at the individual level. So I include a set of controls of individual level, varying over time, and also including industry fixed effects. And after that, what's left of wages in a municipality, which you can interpret as the local wage premium, that portion of wages that after being explained by individual characteristics is now being affected by some characteristics of the municipality, that's the portion that will be affected by the concentration of descendants, and therefore this beta here will be my coefficient of interest. Just to check, Dean, are you all with me still?
I am.
Okay, just checking.
Yep.
This is a experience to be talking for 10 minutes and not see my audience reacting.
Yep, we're here.
Yeah. So let's see the first set of results. Just here correlations from weighted least square regressions for the whole period that I have. So if you look at the bottom here, I have, as usual, increasing controls being added here, year fixed effects all over, these individual level characteristics all over, and from columns 1 to 5, I'm adding state fixed effects, and then a larger array of municipality level controls. And what you observe, I don't want to read a lot on the first column that does include state fixed effects, but from columns 2 to 5, and column 4 is my most conservative one here, is that 1 percentage point, here my concentration of descendants being multiplied by 100, so you can think of that as 1 percentage point increase in that presence of descendant historic migrants is associated with 0.5% larger wages in that municipality. I want to point out here that I have like very precise estimates, but it doesn't come from the big number of individual observations because I'm clustering the standard errors by municipality. So the estimates are precise because they are not just like due to the large number of observations. So one interesting thing to do here, because I have individual level, because I can infer or assign an ancestry for every individual in my data, I can include a dummy in these regressions that assigns ancestry 1 yes if you're non-Iberian, if you're a descendant, or 0, and see how this effect, this association can vary by ancestry. And what we observe here is that being a descendant, and that's something my co-authors have documented before, is associated with a large wage premium. And I want to point out here that all these regressions, they control for education and for race. If you think that race, white, non-white, for example, overlaps perfectly with ancestry in Brazil, it doesn't. So after control for race and education, you still find a significant wage premium for descendants. But then when you look at the effect of the concentration, if you look here in column 4, you see that the effect remains the same, and the effect of the concentration times the dummy kind of goes away. So if I invert this dummy, what you find is that this effect of concentration is being driven mainly by the effect of the descendants of historical migrants on the local population, on the population that's not a descendant. So we have not only a composition effect going on here, you have some evidence of spillovers of transmission. Of course, we have endogenous sorting here. Internal migration is a process that people choose to go. The descendants might choose to go to a region where they think they're going to affect positively that region. So I come up with an IV strategy to try to alleviate these concerns. We are here using an instrument that combines terrain ruggedness and distance to injection points. The idea here is as follows. Most of these people, those descendants, they came from a place in Brazil where mechanized agriculture was taken off. So most of the...
Yes? You have 2 minutes left.
How many?
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay. I'm almost done. So the idea here is that these people wanted to go to a place where they could engage in mechanized agriculture. They want to also go to a place that was not too far away. So you don't like to go far away. You don't like a place that's rugged. Both of those things by themselves, they're strong predictors of migration, of this kind of migration I'm looking here, but they're also not very likely to satisfy the exclusion restriction. But their interaction is better and more likely to satisfy the exclusion restriction and still predicts my migration flow. And the idea here is that, yes, you don't like to go to a place far away, but if that place is also rugged, you don't have like this promising flat farmland, you are less bothered by the fact that it's far away. Conversely, if you look at a place that's very rugged, you don't like it, but it's far away, you're less bothered by that. So just this positive second-term interaction is already enough to give me prediction power in my first stage and is more likely to satisfy the exclusion restriction. Anyway, I don't want to get too much in the weeds of identification here. I'm not making super strong causal claims, but my takeaway of this part is that results remain positive and significant when I go to an IV strategy. They go up a lot in magnitude. I'm still like analyzing what's going on to explain this increase. Might be because the first results were very contaminated by a measurement error. That's very likely. And it might be also that the self-selection that I was trying to get rid of with my IV was not positive to begin with, was negative. I'll go quickly through the discussion of channels. I'll skip, in the interest of time, the idea here, the assumption that we make, but just for you to have a flavor, what are the possible hypotheses that we're raising in the study for what explains this positive effect of the concentration of descendants. We think it might be some ancestry-specific human capital. If the descendants, they have higher human capital, that can be raising the average human capital in a given municipality. Might be they don't have better human capital, they just have a different human capital. And then by increasing knowledge diversity, you're also increasing overall productivity. Might be that people have preference for diversity, so high ability people just go to places that are more diverse, and that brings skills and human capital up as well. Similarly, might be that when I look at descendants, I'm proxying for general internal migration, and internal migrants are possibly self-selected. This actually does not match the data. That regression that I showed you with the dummy rules out some composition effects, so I'm tending to look more here at spillovers going on. The other channels, they operate through the firms and agglomeration effects. We're still investigating those. So again, in the interest of time, I will not comment on those in detail. If you are interested, I invite you to take a look at the paper that I have and I can share with you and explain more. But just to conclude here, what we're doing in this study, we're proposing a way to track descendants of historic immigrants in Brazil today. And we find that there are concentrations associated with the higher wages in the agricultural frontier in the region of study. We argue that this is an evidence of mobile human capital driving this long-lasting impact of an immigration shock. We showed an increase of 4 percentage points with basically one standard deviation in our explanatory variable is associated with an increase of 2.2% in wages. And when we switch from correlations to an IV results, we see that this relationship may be causal and of much larger magnitude, an increase of 4 percentage points. Again, one standard deviation would be associated with higher wages of order of 15%, which is pretty sizable.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome.
Great presentation. We have a couple of questions that have come up. I think they're from you can see them in the chat among the presenters rather than the participant Q&A. Can you see those?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have about 2.5 minutes. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, Yannay, the lusophonization of names, so just people changing names from Portuguese. In some cases, yes. So blacks and native, they were forced to adopt Iberian names in a process similar in other Spanish colonies or in the Philippines, for example. Ceci Cruz has some papers on that. There is some evidence that some immigrants, they adopted Portuguese surname. For instance, some Polish names have names very complicated to pronounce, or in some more particular case out of social stigma, but that's the minority, I would say. So yes, that may happen. I wouldn't think that is too sizable to compromise our results, but that might be explaining part of the measurement error and part of the variation of results when you go from correlations, the least squares to IV, for example. And your second question, what is the difference between the German settlers who tended to remain in identity-preserving communities as opposed to Latin immigrants who I believe are more likely to assimilate? That's true. I would say even more than the Germans, the Japanese. The anecdotal evidence we have in Brazil that the Japanese tend to be more identity cohesive than you have the Germans and then the Italians, for example, if you can make these assumptions. So yes, we could potentially break down this by ancestry. That's something that's in our to-do list. There's a trade-off between the number of observations you could get and the precision of the estimates. And also, just to have an idea, most of I would say that 2/3, half of those descents that I'm looking, they're descents of the Italians, 1/3 are Germans, and the rest comprise Japanese and Eastern Europeans. So yes, to summarize, I'll say your first question is not so much of concern to me. The second question, we can break down by ancestry. That's in the to-do list. I wouldn't expect the first to have big differences, but we might get some.
Well, Eduardo, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, great discussion. I'm glad that we had some discussion at the end of every presentation. That makes us feel like a real conference. This was a great session. Thank you all. I hope you all enjoy interacting with each other during the break. And then we'll, reconvene for the next session at 4 o'clock. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.